therapy. So we'll talk about family therapy. Particular emphasis on, I'm a bit of a disciple, for lack of a better term, of Salvador Minuchin, who is the father of what is called family systems therapy, which looks at the family as a system. And we'll use that to talk about the church as a family, and hope to complement what we've already, the excellent information we've already received. So we'll talk about family systems and how family systems can be applied to our church family. The premise is that transitions that we want to make, particularly when we come back from continuing education experiences like conferences, Prime program, we come back with a whole lot of ideas, a whole lot of inspiration, and then how do you implement those, not just systemically, but in terms of the fact that our systems are made of people. And when you put the people factor in, it becomes quite interesting. And scriptures say that if a man desires the office of a bishop, let him manage his own home well. Presiding premise is, and the suggestion of that, is that our ministries parallel our homes. And our leadership at home usually is an extension, well, let me say that, the way we manage church and the way we manage our homes usually parallel. The strengths and growing opportunities. And so we'll look at those things for the time. Here's my opening prolegomena, if you will, in the overview, in the handout. Combining biblical principles and clinical approaches in family therapy. This class is designed to assist pastors and church leaders develop therapeutic leadership strategies in seasons of transition within the local church family. Like all living organisms, the body of Christ is subject to developmental changes, many of which are essential to its continued survival. Examples of change include new administrative policies, staff additions, staff replacements, new liturgical practices, and more. Though necessary and even divinely inspired by way of our time in ministry growth and prayer, conference attendance, and other means of continuing education. Although our changes are divinely inspired, some changes can yet be potentially traumatic to subsystems within the interdependent familial system, that is the local church, which subsequently affects the healthy functionality of the larger family unit. With such realities in mind, the objective of this course, of this time of sharing, is to provide church leaders with therapeutic approaches to engaging the things that must evolve or go on for the church family to grow. Yes?
Dr. Robinson, I have a good friend who is going to be getting his demon next month. Will he start talking like this?
No. Many of you are already, we are colleagues and peers. And so, he's just talking. I'm a number 5 on the Enneagram. So I'm a book nerd, so thank you for loving me anyway.
Do your thing, man. Do your thing.
Yeah, that's me. I take books on vacation, so to my wife's chagrin sometimes. But in any event, so we'll talk about the family aspect of implementing these changes and additions. And in a very Darwinian sense, the church needs to evolve in order to survive. And so, but the fact that we need to evolve our systems does not mean that it is not a traumatic experience for some of the people and subgroups within our family system. And so we'll look at that today. Dr. Judith Voice is a psychoanalyst who's done some great work. She wrote a book called Necessary Losses, the things we must give up in order to grow up.
Oh, wow.
And maturity is a series of losses. And anytime you change systems, and we'll talk about that a little more when we come, but you're birthing something at the expense of the demise of something. And so there's some things we go through, and that's what we'll talk about as we go through. So there's some things we have to give up in order to grow up, Dr. Voice says. As Paul said, when I became a man, I put away childish things. And so we'll deal with some of that. There is no growth without loss. There's no Sunday without Good Friday. And so that's the very premise that we will deal with, the traumatic side of systemic transition. The familial orientation of Christian ministry is part one. I'm going to talk about the family concept in Christian ministry. I would suggest to you that the church has various analogies that we speak of concerning the church. One of them we've referenced already this morning as the body of Christ. And we use a very anthropological concept when we're talking about that. Paul does it, and we use that scripture. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. So we talk about the church in our language as pastors, as the body of Christ, with strong biblical reference for that. Another analogy we use is as the church militant, becoming the church glorious. Of course, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood and put on the whole armor of God. And they are very militaristic analogies that we're using. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. It's all speaking of the church in very militaristic and militant terms, fighting the culture and principalities and spiritual wickedness in high places. And so that's another analogy we use. And each one of these analogies are appropriate biblically and theologically. Each one of them brings different imagery. So in addition to that, we talk about the church as the bride of Christ. And that is an image. The one we're going to talk about and focus on for our time is as the family of God. And so we'll talk a lot about that, and I'll talk about it as from a therapeutic sense. It is what some would call a blended family. I want to suggest for our consideration today that your church is a blended family.
That's right.
A blended family is if you have a church where you were called to it, and they already had some members, and you brought some people, and some of your members are there because you're the pastor. And other members are there because it's their church. You happen to be the pastor.
Yes, sir.
You are, in the family analogy, you're the similar one to we both brought children to this relationship. Now we're all in the same house. And now in my house, I had 2 kids that had their own room. Now I'm telling 2 kids that came with me, or because of my ministry, that now this is your brother and sister. We all got to learn to live in the same house. And quite frankly, our loyalties are different. And how do we create one team and unite our loyalties when some say, I'm clearly only here because mommy is here. And others say, I'm clearly only here because daddy is here. And how do we, if you will, as church and pastor, create one family out of this blended family that God has joined together? Each one I have, if you will, I have people that have come with me because they knew me before or feel drawn to me. They have a history with me, like the parent, the biological parent and child. Then I have others. And so how do our conversations happen when one group is talking about at the table what the church used to be, and it completely divorces the group that has no memory of what that used to be and really have no interest and are more interested in where you're taking it. That's all blended family stuff. Are we together? That's good. Well, the reason why we can talk about the church as a family is because our theological language is familial. We talk about, in the economy of the Godhead, we talk about God the Father, God the Son. We talk about Jesus as our elder brother, that we are joint heirs with Christ. We call each other things like brother in Christ, sister in the Lord, church mothers.
Yeah.
We stand on a faith that was built by the patristics and who gathered to talk about theological issues and Council of Nicaea and other patristics who got together and formed the Apostles' Creed and the Didache and the foundations of our faith. And so we stand on these fathers of the faith, the patristic from the Latin word pater, meaning father. And so the language of our faith is familial. And there's nothing wrong with that. From a therapeutic perspective, you have to understand that when we talk in familial language, though, we speak in very general terms, but we're speaking to a group of people. In fact, in here, all of us have different familial histories and familial constructs. Therefore, although I'm talking in family in a very general term, there's a presumption that you all have the same concept of family that I do. And that's not necessarily so. You have different familial needs. Every one of us in here has a different familial history and details, though we have family in common. But there is at some point, what is the level of distance between the intention of the communicator of family language and the interpretation of the listener? Because intention and interpretation are not always on the same plane. Are we together? And as communicators, we can communicate, but we cannot control how we connect or how the person interprets. So we have to, at some level, make that clear as we go. Transference and countertransference, in other words, meaning I have or you have certain expectations from a family. Usually those expectations are built from your familial experience. You either want imago therapy, as we addressed last time, meaning that as the listener, as the congregant, you either want your family to be recreated or repaired through your connection to church. You either want this to be like the family that was when I grew up, or I want this to fix the family that I grew up in and be the family I never had. Are we together? We good? So that's transference. So when I'm standing before you as pastor and I'm talking in paternal terms and I'm using Pauline language, you are my Timothy, you are my son, you are my daughter in the faith, then what is the transference that is happening? And how does the listener have a concept of what parenting is? Because parenting creates our attachment styles. In human relations, attachment is how we relate interpersonally. And there are what psychologists call 4 attachment styles: secure, avoidant, anxious, and distant. Without getting too nerdy, Dr. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth were the leading innovators in attachment theory. And what they did was sounds almost sadistic, was put children in a room and with the parent, and then have the parent to leave the room. And through a two-way mirror, they observed how the child acted in the absence of their parents. Some of them found something else to do, and just got involved with stuff. That's one attachment style. Well, they're gone. They'll be back. Okay. I'm all right. And then when they returned, they paid attention to them. Others had an absolute temper tantrum and broke down and never did anything else and eventually cried themselves into fatigue and sleep. That's a very avoidant pattern, a very insecure pattern. And if you've ever, I got 4 kids, if you've ever taken them to daycare for the first day, you've seen the formation of their attachment style. And so when we use, and the pattern is, and the theory is, that those attachment styles kind of set the substratum for all of our relationships. So if you got a clingy member, it can be traced back to an attachment style. And you use the familial term to say, I'm your father in ministry. There's nothing wrong with that, but you just got to know that if they seem clingy, you tied into the transference of their paternal experience. Are we together? So now there's also countertransference, which is how the therapist views the patient or the pastor views the congregant. Which means I'm speaking in terms of paternal language, but there's a certain expectation that I have of you as a son and daughter. And I don't expect you to be clingy. But I didn't communicate that, or perhaps I'm not even aware of what's happening on this very psychological level. So your clinginess is getting on my nerves. So I think you're a bad son and daughter. But I have no idea that in using familial language, I'm also creating this transference in a realm of the psyche. Are we together? Yes. That doesn't mean we don't use it, but we just understand if the more we know about it, the less we are inclined. It's dangerous to be in a position of power and not understand what we're doing to the psyche. Pastor. Yeah. Are we good? Yeah. All right. So this is all family stuff in the church. So the family is blended. Previous children, previous memories of previous experiences, assumptions about the present based on previous experiences, anxieties and expectations about the future. So if I have an anxious attachment style from the parent always being gone, I might need to consider that if I feel like I'm in an evangelistic season when I'm on the road every other month. Because when I return, that's how you can tell the attachment style. If you return to a child and they act like they never knew you, like I have one daughter when we used to come in the room, whatever she started doing in my absence, she acted like she was still doing it. Hey. And me and my wife like, and she's like, well, I got these crayons, I started doing it. What that means is I've learned to live without you. Are we together? I mean, it was just a 3-hour movie. but that's how attachment style works. Are we together? We good? So all of this is happening. So it's multicultural. In my learning experience, we were taught that multicultural is more than just race. But if you have different socioeconomic backgrounds, because poverty has a different culture than wealth and middle class, then if you got impoverished and well-to-do people in your church, you have a multicultural church, at least socioeconomically. Are we together? Because they have 2 different lifestyles and coping strategies. Not to say that one is better. Both are appropriate for their context, because it takes a certain survival skill set for poverty that the person that's well-to-do may not have. And so they both have different values. One has learned to live in the immediate present, which is a value. The other one has learned through their studies that show the middle class has a certain measure of anxiety about the future. And so when you're living with those two in the room, and you got some people in your family that's worried about the mortgage next month, and you got others that's like, I need help today, then you probably have a multicultural family. Just not racially, but socioeconomically. Are we together?
Yes, sir.
So you have all of this in the room. Different levels of education, church mothers, and then people that speak and split verbs but have wisdom, and then you have others that talk like
You?
I was trying to find a way to avoid that.
Are you from this?
I'm gonna keep moving. If you have all of that in your church, then at least from a sociological perspective, you have a blended family, a multicultural family. So our working premise is that there are parallels between subjective family experiences, ministry expectations, and leadership styles. I'm always fascinated by Matthew 18 when Jesus says, except you come to me, converted and become as little children. And in my pastoral context, at least, I'm always amazed at how ministry brings out the inner child in our members. And even in us. By that I mean, I have people that are impoverished, but I also have people with multiple letters behind their name. But when they get in ministry, I see the little child. In the person with the master's degree and the graduate degrees, I see unresolved issues. I see attachment concerns, and so the little child, and it's necessary for God to heal that, because sometimes they use the education actually in the DSM. Intellectualization is a defense mechanism. I'll say that again. In the DSM, intellectualization is a defense mechanism, which means that I've learned to hide behind it, or I've acquired these things and credentials. Then nothing's wrong. I hope y'all hear me. Nothing wrong with it. But nothing's wrong with credentials. But it is human nature to sometimes use credentials to seek a sense of affirmation and self-validation. Are we together? We good? And so that's why, and here's the preacher talking, as a preacher, we don't have to be intimidated by people who have certain letters behind their name just because they have letters behind their name. Because the spirit is over the psyche. And so the letters sometimes are hiding stuff. Mm-hmm. Are we good? And so that's not to say we need to be men of letter and the spirit. Clear. You don't have to get together. How comes out? But I had a guy. He's a great man of God. And he told me that, he was kind of from this new era that doesn't like institutional hierarchy, and that's fine, and cool, not battling with you over that. I get it. I can do the horizontal leadership thing that you are, I'm leading from, in front and not above. I get that. So I'm with you on all of that. But then for a living, he works for the federal government. And he was a GS something. That's it. So hierarchy is okay.
Outside.
Out there.
Right.
For your degree. But in here, you don't want hierarchy. You almost want anarchy. And I'm not saying there are polarities, but I'm just saying it's amazing how the inner child comes out. But the difference, because that person is my supervisor. But in here, you're talking about being my spiritual parent. And so you see the child come out there. We all right? And again, this I'm bad. I'm just raising the complexities of what we're doing when we're just using the nomenclature of the church casually. We're tying into some stuff and don't even know it. Are we together? Yeah. So here's the importance of this. In family therapy, we take a person's history and intake. In family therapy, the client is not a person. The client is the system. The client is the family. So the objective is to work to make the family work. Not make a person look bad. Because oftentimes families have what they call the problem child or the problem issue. But in family therapy, we think of the individual that the family presents as the problem, we interpret as the symptom. The symptom, sometimes what's wrong with our systems will show up in a person. And I'm with you. And we think the immediate answer is to dismiss the person. Yes. But if the system is infected, whoever you put in there is subject to the same symptomology. So sometimes, when I'm trying to save as the family, the answer is not as simple as getting rid of the problem child. Does that make sense? I'm not saying that sometimes that doesn't have to happen. I mean, we pastors, sometimes we got to let people go. All that that's not this. This is the other side. It's not either or, it's and both. But in a systemic approach, I have to ask myself, I hear what you're saying about this person. And I got to ask, is this person assigned to me? Did God send this person to me? And how can I pastor them? Even if I have to do some things differently with them, how can I still be responsible for the soul? And how does this challenge me, not just to look at the person, but to fix the system so that I don't have the same recurring issues? And in order to do that, then I may have to know some family history. This is what we call a genealogram. And this is what sits in our church every week. This is a legend to a genealogram. How you spell it? Genea, Genia, G-R-A-M, gram. That is basically, if you don't like that word, you can say family history record. And so when we're talking to a family as a system, then we start gathering history to see, because the whole psychodynamic premise is that history affects the present. And to fix the future, sometimes we have to go back to the future. And so this is what it looks like. So here's a family. Harmony, friendships, close friendships, best friends, very close, love, in love, hostile relationships in the past, distant hostile relationships. I haven't talked to my brother in years. And everybody in church calling me their brother. Wow. Fused hostile, distrust. I don't trust nobody. Violence. I've had violence in my family. So you want to know why I'm fighting through everything when stuff change? Why am I the brawler in church? I'm the brawler in my house. You said you're my sister in the Lord. Well, I fight my sister. Abuse. Physical abuse. So you want me to say that you are my spiritual dad. Do you know what my dad did to me? Sexual abuse. Neglect. Manipulative relationships. That's the symbol. Controlling relationship. So you sit in the family therapist's office and they're on the pad. That's what they're doing. It's a quick little way to make reference, and they'll work it out in the 10 minutes between you and the next session. Are we together? Good. Not together. No. We're not together. No. You get off the bomb. This is what your family looks like. Now, that's what the biological family looks like. Question is, what would a genealogram of our church look like? What was What was the paternal style of my pastoral predecessor?
Right.
Never.
Right.
How did he leave or she leave pastoral ministry? Was it good? Was it a harmonious departure?
Wow.
Or was it scandalous? Because on some subconscious level now, that's the expectation, or at least the guardedness, that may create some resistance in my church ministry systems. Now, I got to spend the amount of time essentially saying, I'm not the predecessor. I'm not your daddy before. Are we together? So the first part of my ministry becomes healing the past. Before I can even build what the Lord gave me. Does that make sense? Are we together? Because all this is in the house. Believe it or not. All of this may be dressed. I would propose that everybody has a family history.
Yeah.
So somewhere on there, it's not all bad. Some of it is good. So you got all of these different concepts, and we said, we're family. I'm your father in the Lord. And all of these different concepts of family are in the house. And their presumption and my presumption may not be on the same plane.
But Robinson, what's that last one?
Limerence. You know what? I forgot what limerence is. Somebody look that up for me. It's been a minute. I used to know all this by heart.
Infatuated or obsessed with somebody else.
Obsessed with somebody. Yeah, it's obsession. It's an obsessive relationship. Thank you. See, I don't know every word. So all of that is in the house because we all have family history. Did I move on from this? Jerry said we're not good. So church family is a system. The we affects the I and vice versa. And specific roles are both assigned and assumed. And patterns, as Dr. Griffin said, patterns are consciously and unconsciously sustained. Yes, sir.
Question. Is this more pronounced based upon the size of church?
It can be because if the church is small and if you have small and family oriented, if you already have a smaller church and it's and some people prefer smaller churches because they're trying to recreate their family or repair it. I had some leaders that actually complained about our church growth. Because they like it small. Some of them work at mega corporations. And so my business principles were actually offensive to them because that's not what they were looking for. I'm on the presumption and I'm preaching, and the Lord added to the church. When? Daily. And my presumption is that we all want this church to grow. And I had members who don't want it to grow because they like that everybody knows everybody. And so they really working against my system. We got two different systems in the same house. So it does. The size of the church for some people is a preference, consciously or subconsciously. Some of them say they want to grow, but don't want to. They really want to keep it familiar. All that stuff which will get you. So yes, size effects.
And because of controlling dynamics, because they like, as we were talking earlier, the whole leadership component. They like being in charge. When you bring in new people, that means you potentially have to integrate other folks into that whole ministry.
Absolutely.
My first church, they loved visitors, but they didn't want folk to join. They want people there to plant the pews. They do not want people to come in and engage in the ministry level stuff.
Absolutely. On the family therapy level, what you're saying is, you just set all the children down, you and the spouse that have children from previous relationships. You just sat down and said, now listen, we're going to all be a family. And I know the two of you were used to having your own room, but now we're going to put double beds in there. And it's changing their whole world. And so, and I want y'all to get along.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the parameters. So you got xenophobia, fear of strangers. You just opened it up. And that's not a bad thing, but whenever church grows, it changes the system. Acts chapter 6 is evidence of that. The church is growing. We got to change the system. And battles were breaking out. And people were going to their own subgroups and saying, I'll serve you. I got the hook up. I'll make sure you get cake and punch. and then the other side was like, what? Well, you're not really one of the founding members.
That's right.
And so, but what we got to do is change the system. And so, and what it did is it pulled the parents away from being focused on hearing from God to become conflict managers. So yeah, size matters.
So what do you do? I don't definitely don't want to get ahead of your slides, so I may get coming later. But what do you do in terms of those islands of stability, and especially with the us and the them, dissensions?
Hopefully, I'll answer that.
Okay.
Hopefully, I don't plan to leave us on the cross. If the Lord
Right.
in homiletical terms. So the church is an organic system.
Yeah.
Each part being impacted. I don't have to stick it on because we covered that already. Sometimes what's going on beneath the surface is affecting what's happening up here. And what's happening that's visible is affecting what's down here. And so the challenge is to get all of these systems to realize that we need each other. Difference is that as far as we know, these components don't have the same elements of consciousness and quote-unquote volition that we have. So because was the old song used to say, trees don't want to be mountains. They just want to praise the Lord. They just do what they're created to do. But this idea of having volition, and volition that can be corrupted, as the Edenic experience suggests, that we can make wrong choices and self-destructive choices, and the desire that each individual has to be autonomous, and the paradoxical phrase of being social individuals. That we are meant to be in social constructs, and yet we have this desire to individuate. And so, at what degree does my individuation become cancerous to the body? Because in medical terms, free radical cells cause cancer.
That's right. That's right.
So if everybody is autonomous and doing what they want to do with no sense of systemic identity, tumors develop. Because the mass reproduction of free radicalism is cancerous to the body. And ultimately self-destructive to the individual who wants to individuate. Because part of the individual being is dependent on social identity. And that's why the cancer ultimately turns in on itself and kills the very host in its effort to be individual. Are we together?
Say that one more time.
That's the anthropological
that's real.
and existential
That it
tension.
kills the body.
Is that I
Trying
want
to
to be me, but part of being me is being we.
Yes.
Okay.
And so there's a part of me that's afraid of being consumed by the we. And
So
how do I identify with the we without being consumed by the we? Because I'm afraid of the group that it might kill my identity. Yet if I become too radically me and just do my own thing, I'll kill my identity.
And it too.
And it too. And the we. So how do I balance this existential paradox that is social individualism?
I'm listening.
That I need to be me, but I need to be we. Are we good? Yes.
And you said you're going to get us off the cross. When?
He said it's rough.
It's coming.
Here's the cycle of anxiety. I'm with you. I had a professor who said you can't appreciate Resurrection Sunday unless you stay at Good Friday.
Oh, wow.
So here's the cycle of anxiety that people are prone to that make up systems. There's worry, anxiety about what could happen. It creates a belief system. A belief system becomes over-controlling. And then life happens to trigger panic. And it seems like our belief system isn't working. So we worry, create another belief system, over-control, another trigger, panic. And so somehow we have to break this cycle that is happening. And you have to understand that growth and change are normative and necessary. And so that's the dilemma, that we need systems, but we have this proclivity to want to individuate. And the tension between the me and the we, I'm going to move quickly to get us at least to Saturday now. So the essential question is, with all of that familial complexity that is happening, how do we implement this experience to implement change? Get divinely inspired, we pray, through moments like this, through workshops we attend, through continuing education exposure, through iron sharpening iron, dialogue with fellow pastors and colleagues. We get inspired. So you got an inspired leader. And how do we integrate everything that we've just been inspired with into this already existing church family system? That's the fundamental question. In Darwinian terms, how do we evolve to stay alive in this environment? When change is necessary, but change is traumatic to the components of the system. In family therapy, we understand first the familial role of the ministry leader. And that's what I got to. On the spiritual side, you have to know it's our season to lead this change. And that sounds a little simple, but it's profundity in it. That you got to know that it's the season. That you are called, you and I have to know we're called to be agents of change, to move ministry forward for the matter of survival. And something has to die. After the death of Moses, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua and said, go, I will be with you. That here's his warning. You're going to have to be strong. And you're going to have to be courageous. It's going to take a certain level of strength. Are we together? You good? So you got to know that it's your season and expect resistance. In counseling, we are taught that the best way to handle resistance is to go with it, like a good wrestler. Don't fight it. Sometimes let them roll with them and think that they got you so that you can flip again and end up on top. I think I just preached Calvary right there. Sometimes you got to go with it. You got to submit, then flip. and you'll end up on top. I think that's just 3 points. So here we go. So you got to know it's your season. You got to know the voice of the Lord. That means be willing to wait out some stuff. Sometimes one of the hardest things in ministry is having the vision that is burning in us, but it's not for the appointed time. Because back to the vision is for an appointed time, and in the end, it will speak. So what do when you got the fire from Prime and from Hampton and from whatever conference you attend, but you got to wait and keep it hot in you so that by the time it comes, you're not out of it. So you got to know it's spiritual and not just emotional. And so, Joshua, you got to know it's your time and expect resistance. Resistance is a part of therapy. I'll say that again. Resistance is a part of therapy. If you put it in church terms, whenever you're fixing something, whenever you're addressing something, the initial feedback will come from whatever's being evicted. When you are implementing change, and now here's the pneumatological side of it, the spirit realm and the battle. You are the agent of change. You are changing and you are engaging in spiritual phenomenology. And when we get in the realm of the spirit, the first one to fuss and fight back is, I'm not saying the person, hear me in the spirit, is the spirit that's about to be evicted.
That's right.
Wow. Jesus, thou son of David, what hast thou to do with us?
Yes, sir.
The one that's getting ready to get put out is the one that usually speaks up. And so you can expect resistance. But resistance is not your enemy, it's your friend. It lets you know what spirit is about to go. All right. If you stay strong and courageous. Are we together? It's really a revelation. So we expect resistance. What do you mean? I'm anxious. That's the stuff we get in therapy. What do you mean? I'm attracted to him. Well, that's the spirit. Thank you. Like I said, you're attracted to him. I don't know how you see that. Well, it's all I can see right now. But when you go with resistance, this is a therapeutic technique, sometimes people identify with them, and people often take understanding for consent. So they go like, I don't know how you could say that. And I certainly see how that could be very upsetting for you to hear. Your therapist talks back to you like that, that means they're dealing with your resistance. They say, yeah, I understand why you're upset. That's what they said. I'm not agreeing with you. I'm just saying, I understand how you could be upset. Yeah, that can be tough. Yeah. But have you thought, here's the flip, but have you thought that perhaps there's another way to look at it? That's the flip. Did you catch it?
Yeah.
So you can expect resistance when you're trying to implement systemic change. Anticipate it. It's on the sheet that Dr. Griffin gave me. He said, what's the feedback? So expect it. Just go into it, knowing that you got to be strong and courageous. In marriage and family therapy, the principle is you got to join the family before you can implement certain changes. You got to tie in before you can get buy-in. Be inspired, like the therapist is taught, like in family therapy, if they all seated like this, then here's my seat right here in the circle. Because I'm in here with you. Because we working this out together. I'm not the expert lording over you, standing over you, telling you what you ought to do and what your problem is. No, I want to sit here right among you because I'm going to work the change from within the system. Yeah, I know. I am the resident theologian, but I'm not going to lord that over you right now. I'm just sitting through here with you. And I'm going to be the agent of change from within. I know I come, but I'm new. I'm a pastor. I know that. But right here, I just want to sit with you. I just want to talk with you. And I'm going to flip. I'm going to submit sometimes. Oh, I see what you mean. But then I'm going to flip it. Because I already know. I'm not in surrender. But I'm tying in to get buy-in. Because I need to hear what your concept of a father is. So I can start. Just I'm mindful. I need to gather information. Information is power. Are we together? You good? So that the buy-in is important. Know your people. That's the simple way. Know the system. Know the system that you intend to change. I'm fascinated by this verse where he says, be strong and be of good courage. The second thing is, let the Lord remember that he's an agent of change. Joshua, the Lord says to Joshua, I will begin to magnify you in the eyes of the people. Here it is. I already know what I put in you, but they don't see it yet. He said, I will begin to magnify. Mm-hmm. There's a process that is bigger than anything we learn in sessions like this. There's a process where God says, I'm going to change their perception of you as the leader of this family. Everything that's in you, they don't see. But I am going to develop your leadership. Develop is the exact epistemological reverse of envelop. When you envelop something, you hide it.
Yeah.
When you develop something, you take the cover off. So that, as Aristotelian philosophy says, all of the power of the acorn, of the oak tree, is in the acorn. The acorn just needs to be developed. So there's a phenomenology with that nobody can explain. But God will create a scenario, Joshua, for the people to see that you're my man. Wow. I don't care what it is. It's going to come in the form of a crisis. Yes. The crisis is actually going to develop your role as the family leader. It's going to develop you. It's going because stuff that I put in you is going to start coming out of you. So I'm going to create a crisis. You got a river to cross. And that's the crisis. The crisis is not going to cause you to lose your ministry. It's going to magnify your leadership in the eyes of the people. They're going to say, oh yeah, you are my daddy. Because you put food on the table when I was hungry. Yeah. Yes, sir. I'm going to give you, I already gave it to you, but I'm going to cause the people to see what I put in you. And you can't make them see that. I got to give them that revelation. You just got to do everything I told you to do. Keep showing up, Joshua. Be strong. Be courageous. Keep out in the pulpit. Keep sharing your vision. Keep implementing. Don't let it get under your system. Don't be like Moses and strike the rock in anger. Don't flex your ego. Don't get caught up trying to impress your peers with how much you're in charge. I'm going to create the crisis. It's not going to break your leadership. It's going to make your leadership. Because they're going to come to you and say, help us get across this river. Yes, good God. Does that make sense to anyone? And when they come, be ready. Lift it up. We're going to step in the water. And when we get midway, that's what we're going to do. And on the other side, you can build your vision. Get 12 stones. Build me a memorial to what we already covered, and let's move forward. Because now, I see you differently now. Because you got us cross this river. So let's leave our past right here and move on. Only God can do that part. Does that make sense to anybody? It's like if you had a child that you ever taught the principle of Santa Claus. One day they realized that it was you that's been the provider all along. Are you with me? And so that's how leadership develops. We do all of our training and have our plan, but there is an element when God says, I'm going to change the people's perception of your leadership. And it's good for us to remember that as you've been pastoring a while,
Yes, sir.
I am now in the process of changing some systems that I put in place. I built the system by the grace of God that the Lord is now saying that was for then and this is for now. And I believe I got some witnesses in here that when you build a system, you impart authority and power. And power is easier to give than it is to take. Can I get a witness? All right. So in family therapy, this is how we describe it. It's the law of the thermostat. Here's a good idea of how systems work: is the thermostat in your house. You set the atmosphere for what makes you comfortable. When you set that atmosphere, a system kicks in to maintain the atmosphere you set. And everything in the house works to keep everything the way you set it. It's called homeostasis. Everything. So that means if somebody opens the door in the winter and a cool wind comes in and hits the thermostat, the system rushes to preserve what is. And to prevent what has come in from changing the atmosphere. I want you to hear that as new members that's joining your church. So the system that you set it.
That's good.
And you put everything in the house in place to keep it the way
You like it.
you're comfortable. And then somebody opens the door. Oh, I hope y'all hear me in the spirit. And a wind comes in. And the wind shifts the atmosphere in the house.
Right.
And everything in the system you set starts saying, we don't want that wind. And put stuff back in place. Here it is, so that the wind has no effect. So now you asking what happened to the wind? The wind was overshadowed by the system that you set for your comfort. Oh God, are you together? And the system is fine until the season changes.
Until you change.
What do you do when the season has changed? And God says you got to reset the system. Because the system that made you comfortable in January will take you out in July. Oh my God. What happens when God says you need to be the agent of change you want to see? Now you go back to the thermostat. And you change the system. And everything in the house has to readjust. Everything. When you change the system, you fired the furnace and hired the air conditioner. And now the difference is the furnace will just release its power. But the furnace is not a person. And your person that was your furnace has an attachment to the old season. And if you learn anything from the ministry of Jesus, that he changes the system. And some people who were used to the old system will crucify you before they'll change.
Come on now.
Are we all right? So now, I only got about 7 minutes left. I got to expedite us.
Come on in.
So I got to change the system. Am I talking to anybody? You ever had to change the system you set? Because growth has happened, be it personal growth, be it ministerial growth, and now you're the dad that comes in and has to have a family meeting and say, I know this is where we've been, but this is where we got to go.
Yeah.
And all your children have gotten used to the new routine. Now you want to give them new chores for a new house and a new season. And everybody has got to change something. People who wore sweaters have now got to go and box up what they did in the last season and take out and put on some stuff for the new season. And they have attachment to the things they have to put away. We good? So I'm going to change that. So, all right, cool. All right, here we go. I'm closing. So you have to have, first of all, know that you're called. Know that it's your season. Know that you may, know that you're changing a system sometimes that we set in place as the spiritual parents. We good?
Yeah.
And thirdly, we have to acknowledge that there's stages of change. It may be helpful to remember when you're changing systems that change happens on a cycle. In rehab therapy, working with persons who have substance abuse issues and others, and other addiction issues, this is how change happens because people become addicted to systems. First stage is what we call pre-contemplation, which means changing the system ain't even on my mind. Oh man, we never even thought about it. We never even thought about, because again, it's the wonderful example, what's water? This is the way we've been living. So I've never even thought. We had not so much as heard that there be the Holy Ghost. So it ain't even on my mind. Are y'all with me? Yeah. And so then, when we come and we start on the second stage of change is thinking about change. Now, how does that work? If I'm beginning to change the thermostat, I might want to, again, take it in context for your ministry, but these are the stages of change. My next step might not be the instant change that I was inspired with Sunrise. My next step in progress is if I at least got them thinking that change happens. So my approach in my vision casting meeting might be, would you think about this? You know what? This is what I want to do. Just think about how much more we could grow if we did this instead of that. Just think about it. It's scripture we talk about how he said, try me in this and see. So the measure of success from that meeting is not always the enforcement of the will. Now that works, but sometimes I have to ask, do I just want compliance or do I want commitment? Because compliance only works as long as there's the fear of leverage being worked against me. But commitment means I can walk away from it and work on some other stuff and know you committed to the vision that I gave you, so I don't have to oversee you every 5 minutes. So if I want commitment and not just compliance, then I may have to think the next success move in the stage of change is thinking about it. And then next stage of change is preparing to change. Who are the stakeholders? Who's affected by this change? Do I have to implement John Maxwell's law of E.F. Hutton? Have some meetings with the power brokers and influential people on the side so that my public meeting goes the way it needs to go? Who's influencing my meeting that I don't know about with secret signals? So I need to get them at least thinking about it, to being prepared to do it. Actually, now we can start making changes. And this may all happen in a week. I'm just saying, or may happen in a year. But it's just a way of looking at how systemic change affects the psyche. Maintaining changes. And then relapse. Sometimes happens. Sometimes in crisis, people go back to what they do. And so I have to manage that and then implement something else. But there are the stages of change. And whenever there is change, that's what I started out with talking about Judith's voice and the things you have to give up to grow up. There is the anticipation of grief reactions. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. That cycle happens in church when we change systems. It's not, and if you anticipate it, you can be better prepared for it. Are we together? Here's a great example. The builders, Ezra 3, laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord. And look at this from a clinical perspective of what's happening in this family. They're getting a new house. It says, all the people shouted with a great shout, but many wept with a loud voice. That's a grief reaction. So that the people could not discern the noise of the shout from the noise of the weeping. You got to know that on a clinical level, when change happens, you might have two sounds in your house for a while. That's right. And my assignment hopefully is to acknowledge the weeping and say, yeah, I know that was rough, but God is moving us on. But the glory of the latter house shall be greater than the former. Believe it or not, God is up to something. So my assignment is to acknowledge the grief so that eventually the sound of joy can overtake the sound of grief. Yeah. I got to encourage the rejoicers to say, listen, I don't want y'all to stop. Actually, I need more of you. I'm going to go over here and work with them. And y'all keep doing what you're doing. I certainly understand, but try me in this because God has shifted this. And so we want to battle against, in therapy we call it misplaced grief. Misplaced grief is when you get mad at the agent of change who is not the change agent. When God has changed something, but you need to anthropomorphize your frustrations, which means you need a scapegoat. So you need to make the pastor the problem. You got to know that you're going to be with Christ. You're going to be the scapegoat for some change. You got to know that you have to bear some stuff that is really you following through with the will of God. But you can't fight God. When I was doing my chaplain residency, like many of you, they used to call us down to the ER when crises happened and tell us to go with a security person. And I asked my supervisor, why we got to go with security? Because sometimes when people are in grief, they go off on you. You had nothing to do with what happened, but you become the object of frustration. And so sometimes we have to be prepared to handle the misplaced grief of people when we're implementing change. And so I have to go over here and deal with this. But I need y'all to keep making the sound over here, because eventually this sound is going to be the sound. Does that make sense? Are we good?
Yes, sir.
So as I close, the objective, and you can take all of this and please contextualize it for what's appropriate and important in your context. But the objective is to give more tools to your toolkit. How do you see the people who are resisting change in your system? If you only got confrontation, then that's your tool. If you only got exorcism, then you're going to demonize them for grieving. I'm going to say that again. When you only got exorcism in your toolkit, yeah, you'll get some people, because I know some people that's full of the devil. I got you. But if you only got exorcism, you'll demonize people for grieving. And they don't need an exorcist, they need a therapist.
That's right.
And so avoidance means I'm trying to act like it ain't happening. If that's all you got, I'm just going to stand and preach the word. so you might need to have some meetings.
That's right.
Because sometimes people hear the word and don't see how it applies to them. I'm always fascinated that Jesus sat at a table and gave him a word, one of you shall betray me, and Judas went right out and did it. It never occurred to him when they said, will you take 30 pieces of silver? I know that's an interesting philosophy debate between free will and destiny. But Peter, before the rooster, so here's the sermon, you're going to deny me 3 times. You heard it 3 times. The first time didn't suggest something. The word didn't come back to you. Didn't you just hear that sermon? Right. That you're going to deny me 3 times? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. What was the disconnect between the pulpit and application? So sometimes I can't just preach it out. I got to meet with them afterwards to say, this is how the word affects the change we're going through right now. Oh, I never looked at it that way. Well, I just hawked and spit for 45 minutes. I thought you got it. I thought you got it in there. No, but I sure enjoyed it. That's why they say, "Ooh, Pastor, you preach." What did I say? I don't know, but you said something. Oh my God. Because you can't assume that the homiletical transfer is happening to everyday application. And so these are just more tools for our toolkit. I'm going to stop right there because my time is up. Any questions, feedback? Yes, sir.
You talked about systems. In your opinion, can a system operate if individuals who are supposed to be a part of the system, if they have to change, or is it necessary that they have to change with them? You see what I'm saying? Can the system be called for them to operate without people having to change?
The straight answer to that is yes, but not as well. Or yes, but at higher risk of complete system failure. Because you take the body, for example, when one part is not functioning fully, others kick in to keep us alive, but they can only compensate for so long before there's a complete breakthrough. Or blockage causes strokes.